Here's another fellow said, he just didn't understand. He said, my wife asked me to take her to one of those restaurants where they make the food right in front of you. So I took my wife to Subway, and that's where the fight started. I like this one too. This fella was so amazed at his wife. I mean, his wife just seemed so patient and so great, even when sometimes he flew off the handle. So he asked his wife one night when they were sitting watching TV, he said, honey, whenever I get mad at you, you never seem to get upset. How in the world do you manage to control your temper like that? She said, I go and clean the toilet. He said, how does that help? She said, I use your toothbrush. Here, the wife says to her husband, I have a bag full of used clothing that I'd like to donate. The husband said, well, why not just throw it in the trash? That'd be much easier. The wife said, there are poor, starving people who really could use these clothes. The husband said, honey, whoever fits in your clothes is not starving. The husband is recovering from a head injury on that one. And here is some good advice to a man. If a woman says, do what you want, do not do what you want. Stand still. Do not blink. Do not answer. Don't even breathe. Just play dead. But don't do what you want. Communicating is just very difficult. This one wife says, honey, please go to the supermarket and get me 1 gallon of milk. And if they have bananas, get me 6 bananas. He came back with 6 gallons of milk. The husband was confused about his wife's reaction. And she said, honey, what in the world did you come back with 6 gallons of milk for? Because they had bananas. He still doesn't understand why the wife yelled at him, since he did exactly what his wife told him to do. A wise man said to his son, son, when you accumulate the understanding that you know why a pizza is made round, and then it's put in a square box and is eaten in triangles, then, my son, you will be able to understand women. I think that's good counsel from a daddy to his son. Well, since we're going to be talking about marriage after loss, here is this woman who says to the Lord, Lord, I'm not asking you to send me another husband, but I would at least like his tracking number. Oh, boy. Marriage after loss is what we're going to talk about. Now, how many of you know somebody who's lost their spouse and married again? You know them personally, okay? A lot of us probably know people. If we stopped and thought about it, we know people or know people distantly who have lost their spouse and they have decided to remarry. Not everybody who experiences the loss of their spouse gets remarried. As a matter of fact, as much as I hate to say this publicly, it's the truth. So I'm going to go ahead and say it. The reality is it's very, very hard statistically. If you just think about it statistically, it is very hard for a woman to get married after losing their spouse. Here's the reason why. It goes back to something we've talked about. If there are 4 to 5 times more widows than there are widowers, the pool of possibilities, to put it in a statistical terminology, the pool of options for a female to get remarried is a very small pool, very shallow pool. Now, that's not true with a widower. Widowers are far more likely to get remarried because there is a much bigger and deeper pool of possibilities for them. When you stop to think about how there is an overwhelming number of females who are widowed in contrast to males who are widowed. There is the option, obviously, because we're released or free to do that. Now, I'll bet some of us, in the people that we know who've experienced this, we know of them having great experience. And let me share with you some great experiences. Travis Irwin, who's the involvement minister at the Athens, Tennessee church, over in East Tennessee. When I inquired with him, he's been a good friend of mine for years, and I inquired with him about this remarriage business. He said, my dad died in January of 2013. There was a man at Mom's church whose wife died before my dad died. He took care of his wife for 12 years. I performed the wedding ceremony for Bob and my mom last April. Mom is 88 and he is 78. I was in Medina, Ohio, and doing a widowhood workshop there. There was this lady who came to me who was obviously, she was glowing. She said, I want to tell you my story. And I thought, well, boy, I need to let her tell this story because it's obviously good. And so she told me her story. And I said, please, sister, would you send me that story in email form? And so I hold it in my hand. This woman lost her husband in 2012, and she was married for 38 and a half years. The man in the story lost his wife in 2013, a year after the woman lost her husband. This man lost his wife in 2013, and she and him, this man, they had been married for 40 years. They ended up in the same church. What's weird about this is they knew one another like decades before, but it had been decades. And so basically, they had disconnected for several decades. Well, here it is, decades later, both of them have lost their spouses, and they're in the same church in Medina, Ohio. She said, we met for the first time, and I'm going to read this to you. We met the next Wednesday after Bible study at a local McDonald's. I was so nervous, I was shaking. Now, I'm here to tell you that this whole male-female thing, the male-female relationship after loss is weird. It is really weird. Whenever we're young, it is just a natural thing. You meet somebody, you become attached to them. You eventually get to the point where you say to yourself, you love them. But that's the natural thing. It is very weird after loss. As a matter of fact, one of the most hilarious experiences I've ever had was with that group of widowed people over in West Tennessee, when I had promised them that I was going to talk to them and we were going to have this open discussion about male-female relationships after loss. That was in July of last year when I told them that. Well, in August, at the next meeting, after we socialized together, had a great meal together, I said, okay, I want to get everybody's attention. I want us to talk about, very openly, about male-female relationships after marriage or after loss. Well, there was a lady in the back right of that room who raised her hand and interrupted me and said, Dean, it's a good thing that you're doing this, because when we were in the car together, they came in a car for several miles. When we were driving in the car over here, we were going to remind you that you promised to talk about this month. See, they had remembered this was an issue that they wanted to talk about. When have we ever talked about this kind of stuff at church? When have we ever openly talked about this so that people can at least get some different perspectives and maybe have an easier time after the loss and trying to interact with the opposite gender after loss? That evening was the most hilarious experience I've ever had with widowed people, because one after another, they told personal stories about experiences. And this one lady had the Baptist preacher in town who was widowed come and knock on her door and ask her out on a date. And she didn't want to go, so she basically shut the door on him. He came back to her door. I don't know how long after it was. He came back to her door and he proposed to her at the door because he wanted to get married to her. I mean, and then we had people in that group. They just had a real interesting discussion that night we did about what's a date. What is a date? I had this conversation with this lady in Middle Tennessee a few years ago, because I could tell in talking about male-female relationships, I could tell that I needed to try to get into her head, as scary a thought as that was. I needed to get in her head and ask her, what is a date? I could tell by the way she was talking. I needed to know that. She said, okay. She said, a date is when he picks me up and he pays the bill. Well, twice after that conversation, I met her at a restaurant in Franklin, Tennessee. And when we went to the register, I paid the bill and I turned to her and I said, this is not a date. You drove here. I paid the bill, but I didn't pick you up. It is funny how that some people, some people may have been on dates and never knew it because the other person thought they were on a date. I had this older gentleman who had lost his wife over in West Tennessee who came to me the night of that discussion out in the parking lot before he left. He said, hey, Dean, me and Teresa, she was another attendee at that fellowship. He said, me and Teresa, we've been out on dates, but Dean, she doesn't think they're dates. I said, brother, that's what we were just talking about. I said, you got to realize that your view of what a date is and their view of what a date is may be totally different. It's easy to figure that stuff out when you're younger. It's way more difficult when you mature some, and especially after loss. It is just a very, very different world. So here you've got this man and woman in northern Ohio, and they're going out together at this McDonald's to have coffee after Wednesday night church, but it's not a date. They haven't had their first date yet. I'm getting to that point. So she said, we met at McDonald's for coffee. I was so nervous. I was shaking. We had had a couple of nice chats, and the next couple of weeks, we chatted on the phone occasionally, then went out to dinner together. It was a date. He picked me up. This must be common among women. She said, it was a date. She said, because he picked me up. In July, he went to visit his son in Arkansas. He loves to travel. In the meantime, I had to go into the hospital for heart problems. We didn't see each other for over a month and spoke briefly on the phone. I was dealing with other health issues as well and suspected breast cancer. She was diagnosed with breast cancer. She explains in this email that she knew what was going to happen then. He was going to turn tail and run. She just was counting on that. What's really neat about this is she tells the story about after her diagnosis, and then she started treatments. She lost all of her hair. And during the course of those treatments, she was puking her guts out. And he stayed with her every step of the way. Amen. She said, I had him in my presence. When I looked the worst I could possibly look, and when I felt the worst that I could possibly feel, he was with me. Well, what happens is she ends up healing and getting better. The treatments worked. And as a matter of fact, they got married. Great, beautiful story. No wonder she was smiling like a Cheshire cat when she was telling me this after that widowhood workshop in Medina, Ohio. And then I love this word, this sentence in this email. She said, I never thought I could love someone else, and neither did he. I have so many neat stories of people who have had just great experiences. One of my favorite couples that got married after loss was Bill and Verl over in Woodson Chapel Church in Nashville. Both of them had been married for a long time. The man's spouse had ovarian cancer. Her husband had Parkinson's disease. Both of them lost their mates. He had been widowed for about 14 years when his son came to him and said, Dad, why don't you ask Verl out on a date? Well, he didn't do it initially. He'd been 14 years widowed. And after a while, he said, well, yeah. So he picks up the phone and he calls Verl. He asked her out on a date. She said yes. And he said at that point, I had no idea what to do. He'd never been down this road before. He didn't have a clue about dating, but they ended up going out on a date. Then they spent some more time together, and eventually they got married. When she wrote to me about their personal story in her own handwriting, I love the end of that letter she wrote to me. She said, now God's work can be done together. Oh, such a neat, beautiful story. Now, the reality is that not everybody's experience is like that. As a matter of fact, it can be quite different. Let me share with you Diane Shubstall and a little bit about her story. This was 2.5 years after she lost her husband. He died the month before my wife did. And I went to his memorial service, as a matter of fact. One Sunday, she was preparing breakfast, and she sent her teenage daughter down to the basement to get her daddy, and she found her daddy dead on the floor. They were married when she was 19 and he was 23. They'd been married for 23 years, and they had two daughters. One was 13, one was 16. This is 2.5 years after her loss. She sends me this email. I asked her about the whole dating and remarriage thing. She said, first of all, it scares me to think about the whole thing of dating and just starting over. I'm not sure I can love someone again like I loved Gary. I am very lonely and I miss his companionship every day. We talked about it before, about if something were to happen to one or the either of us, that we would want the other to remarry. It was easy to talk about it then, but not now. He's gone. I would like to be able to love again, but I'm not sure my heart is ready or I'm able to handle that again. It scares me because I know if I get remarried, that if my spouse goes before me again, I don't know if I could stand the pain of losing another spouse again. I don't know if I could ever do that. You see the troubledness and the struggle with the whole idea of even dating, much less thinking about remarrying. One of the saddest stories is one that was posted publicly on Facebook. This is a lady in southern Indiana who I remember also was an elder's daughter in the Lord's church. She posted this on Facebook. I'm going to read you most of this post. I don't normally write very personal posts, but because of the fact that I think my Facebook friends are like family to me, I want to tell you all of the recent events in my life. I know some of you are concerned about me, and I appreciate that more than you could possibly know. It's hard to talk to everyone all the time, so maybe this post will answer some of your questions and elicit some prayers. Please know that this is difficult for me to write, but I feel like I can make everything clear. I'm just ashamed that I made such an impulsive decision. As most of you know, my husband Jim passed away in June of 2014. It forever changed my life. I was vulnerable, devastated, and naive. I met someone a month later, and we married in July of 2015. So there's a year after death, after loss. While that may seem very quick at the time, I couldn't see it. I was lonely and should never have remarried so quickly. I don't want to go into details on Facebook, but after several rounds of heartache with this person, I am now divorcing. Being a teacher in a small town for 25 years lends itself to knowing many, many people. I am taking back Jim, her first husband. I'm taking back Jim's last name, as he was the love of my life and my soulmate. Please pray for me and Lexi as I continue to grieve for Jim and as I move forward from this very embarrassing situation. You all know me, and you know that all I ever wanted was a loving marriage like many of you have. Now, let me share with you a statistic from the U.S. Census Bureau. If widowed people remarry within 2 years of their loss. Now, I want you to remember, statistics are statistics. They're not individual. They're generally statistics. The U.S. Census Bureau says that if a widowed person marries within 2 years of their loss, over 50% of those marriages end in divorce. Now, I would have thought that with that marital experience and that greater wisdom, that you'd be better prepared for the second marriage than you ever were the first marriage. But no, what happens sometimes is people who have lost their marriage will self-medicate by marrying again. And when you stop to think about it. If you love being a wife or you love being a husband, and for years, maybe decades, that's what you were, and you want to get that identity back, how do you get it back? You marry again. And sometimes you're grieving so deeply and you're so lonely that what you desperately want is you want to be married again because you think that that's going to stop you from being lonely. It's going to fill that void and that loneliness. Now, you got to remember that after loss, your emotions are really high. When we're really high emotionally, we have a hard time thinking rationally. That's why with high school graduation time, it always scares me to death when these kids graduate from high school, because a lot of them end up doing things because they're on such a high emotionally, because they have graduated. They're an adult now. They don't have to go to school anymore. So they'll go out and do some really stupid things. They'll live on the edge and do really stupid things, sometimes get hurt, sometimes have sex with somebody who's not their spouse, sometimes die in accidents because they were celebrating, they weren't thinking straight. The same thing is true when we're really emotionally grieving deeply. We're not thinking very straight. So sometimes to self-medicate, just like a person who's depressed, sometimes a person who's depressed and won't go to a psychologist or a psychiatrist to get the appropriate help, they'll self-medicate. They'll turn to alcohol. They'll turn to methamphetamine. They'll do something to self-medicate because they hate this depression. Well, if you're grieving because of the loss of your spouse, you get married again and you won't be grieving anymore. Well, no, that's not human. That's not human. You don't replace people. Keep this in mind for the rest of your life. I don't care who it is that you lose. I don't care what kind of relationship you had with them. People are not replaced. Flat tires are replaced. Cars are replaced. Houses can be replaced. People are not replaced. Even if you were to get married again, you are not replacing your spouse. And if you think you are, you're in big trouble. You're ill prepared for that second marriage, because that second marriage will not be like that first marriage. You know why? It's two different people. Number one, you've experienced a crisis time in your life. You have gone through the devastating experience of losing your spouse. And number two, you've never been married to that person. So it's going to be a totally different marriage that second time. This is something that really we need to talk about openly and frankly. And we need to do some of this publicly in the church. And that's why I finally gave in and added this to this widowhood workshop. For a couple of years, I did widowhood workshops and I avoided this subject like the plague. The reason why I did was I knew how tempting it was going to be for me to seek to be remarried again. I at least knew enough about human beings, about my personal human being experience, and about emotions. And I'd read enough about that sort of thing that I knew that it was going to be very, very tempting. So I didn't even look into the subject. I didn't even avoid it. I just avoided it. I just didn't want to even deal with it. But then after I got so many questions about it, I thought, okay, I got to deal with this. So here you go. Here's some things to think about. Marriage after loss. In 1 Corinthians 7, there's this passage that has been debated a bunch, typically because of the last phrase there. But if her husband dies, she's at liberty to be married to whom she wishes. But then there's that phrase, only in the Lord. Now, there are two different ways that phrase could be understood. You know, going back to English class again, remember about adjectives and adverbs. Adjectives modify nouns. Adverbs modify verbs. Now, we have the right to be married again, just as much as a legitimately divorced person has a right to remarry, Matthew 19:9. They have as much right to be married again as they did the first time. The same truth also applies to somebody who's lost their spouse. They're free to be married to whomever they wish. But then there's that qualifying phrase, only in the Lord. Now, is that an adjective-like phrase or is it an adverbial phrase? Now, here's what I mean by that. Does that phrase modify the marrying, or does it modify the person that you're marrying? See, there's the difference. In other words, the reality is not everybody has the right to be married. Remember what got John the Baptist in trouble? he said, you know what? You don't have a right to her. Well, he lost his head because of that, eventually. You know, we need to be careful. There was a previous president, who I'll not mention, who said that it is terrible that we would restrict somebody's love and not let anybody who loved marry. Now, that's about as stupid a statement as a mature human being would ever make. Do you know that there is an issue that probably none of you have studied much. There's a bestiality issue. Can you imagine engaging in intimate relations with an animal? It was in ancient times. It is still now. There are people who love their pets. If it hasn't happened yet, I guarantee you, because of how stupid our world is getting, there's going to be a legal granting of a right for a citizen, and I hope it doesn't happen in this country, but I can imagine it happening in this country. You marry a pet because you love them. You marry someone of your own gender because you love them. See, love justifies the marriage. That's how many people think. Not everybody has a right to marry everybody else. Marrying whom we wish, that's important. But notice what he says here about this marriage after loss, only in the Lord. Does that modify the marrying? In other words, you need to be careful to only marry somebody who you have a right to marry. Not everybody has a right to marry. So are you marrying somebody who has a right to marry? So it modifies the marrying. Or does it modify the person that you're marrying? Now, if it's the person that you're marrying, then what does that say about that person? If they're in the Lord, then who are they? They're a Christian. They are a Christian. For years, for decades, I had a policy as a local preacher that I would not officiate in wedding ceremonies where a Christian was marrying a non-Christian. Not because I thought it was sinful, because it's not. As a matter of fact, I'll defend the right to do that. But I will also question the wisdom of doing that. Spiritually, I think it's soul gambling. It is much easier to pull somebody down than it is to pull somebody up. Now, I realize there have been people who have married Christians, who have married non-Christians, and they've helped them to grow and eventually become Christians. But for every one of those that you mentioned, I'll get 10 real quick to trump your one who got married and then became weaker as a Christian or became an unfaithful Christian. I think it's soul gambling, and I don't want to help anybody do that. Now, I'll go to their wedding. I'll buy them a present. I'll even do their premarital counseling. I'll do their postmarital counseling. It's not a sin, but I question the wisdom of doing that. Is this instructing those people who've lost their mate to marry only a Christian, only consider that, or is it reminding them how important it is to make sure they marry somebody who has the right to be married? The answer from me is, I don't know. Here's what I do know about that phrase. It is restrictive in nature. You cannot question that. No matter what side you come down on in regard to that argument, that is a restrictive phrase, only in the Lord. What that is, it's a red flag. It is telling people who've lost their mate, be careful. You can't just go marrying anybody. You have got to be careful. Let me quote you a line from a book that I used in premarital counseling for years. Here's the quote. I can quote it exactly. The most miserable people in the world are not single people who wish to be married, but married people who have decided their marriage is a mistake. That's miserable. There are a lot of miserable married people. And some of those people are miserable married people after they've lost their mate and they married again. All I know for sure is that's a restrictive clause. And here is what I would suggest generically to anybody after loss. Be careful. Now, we should be careful the first time, but the first time is a done deal. Whenever you marry after loss, you got to remember you're not the same person. You're vulnerable, just like, remember that lady in southern Indiana? And there are other people I can share with you have experienced the same type of thing. We just have to be extremely careful. Well, when you think about that issue, look at this quote here. Einstein has written a lot of good stuff on the step family and the blending of families. The most critical key for remarriage preparation is to resolve or mourn the loss of former relationships. Now, that's true whether it's the end of a marriage by divorce. That's true if it's the end of the marriage by death. You have to put yourself in rehab. Some way, somehow, you need to experience rehab. You need to get to a better place. You need to understand what you've been through a little bit better, more clearly. You need to rehab yourself and become that different person and that different identity. It's not something to jump into right after you've experienced loss. I love this observation. You have to be okay on your own before you can have a healthy relationship with another person. People have asked me about when is the best time for a widowed person to marry. Here's the way I would respond to that, because I know what they're asking. They're wanting the number. They're wanting a number. 6 months, 2 years. They're wanting a number. Here's the answer I would give. Whenever you have experienced loss and you have recovered to a degree and spiritually exercised to a degree that you are content in your life after loss, that's the best time to consider getting married again. Because you're not marrying out of a felt need. You're marrying because you desire that relationship. You don't feel like you have to do it. We're going to talk a little bit about this contentment business of a Christian. But it's really important for us to find contentment in our resolved life after our loss before we make really big, important decisions, especially ones that we are going to be biblically, divinely obligated to live with the rest of our lives. Let's be okay with ourselves first. You have seen this passage before. You've heard preaching about this passage before. I want to read to you the context of Philippians chapter 4, where there is an often misquoted passage in Philippians chapter 4. It's quoted and used in a universal sense when actually we need to look at its context. In Philippians chapter 4, the Apostle Paul is in prison. And he is in prison not because he's done something terribly wrong, but because he's been serving the Lord. So he's in this situation, and he doesn't deserve to be in this situation. And in this situation, he talks about his condition. It's in Philippians chapter 4. I'm going to begin at verse 11. Not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. Now remember the prison thing and the reason why he was in prison. I know how to be abased and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things, I've learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer loss. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That verse 14 is the one that's quoted sometimes and applied universally. As if I wanted to be a WWE wrestler, I could be a WWE wrestler. Well, that statement about I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me is in a context where he's talking about contentment. Paul is saying, I don't care what it is. I don't care where my life leads me or what I experience. I can be content. I can be in a miserable condition. I can abound, prosperity. I can plunge into adversity and be abased. Because of the strength I get through Jesus, I can be content no matter what. No matter state. Notice the word state. Give me the states of marriage. You know, sometimes you get these forms about your marital state. What are the options? They're usually 4. What are your options? Single, married, widowed, divorced. Okay. That's a state, right? Can a single person be content?
Yeah.
Yeah. What about a married person?
Yeah.
Yeah, but there are some discontented married people. It's no guarantee, is it? Can a cancer patient be content?
Yes.
Can a person be content if they've lost their home? It's burned up. Terrible, horrible fire.
Eventually, yes.
Could a parent who's lost a child be content? Stop and think about all the different things we could experience in life. What the Apostle Paul teaches us, that we can be content, it's not something we're born with, it's something we have to work at. Learn, he said. He used the word learn. I have learned in whatever state I am. Learning is a painful thing. Do you remember school? Remember how painful that school was? Okay. Learning takes time and effort, and sometimes it's painful. But we can learn if we give ourselves the effort and the time. We can learn to be content no matter what. That's why I prayed to the Lord that he would help me to find contentment in my widowhood. Because I knew that that's the only way I could totally give myself to this widowhood workshop ministry for the first few years. And I thought, well, then if conditions are right and things are okay, then I could get married. Not because I feel like I have to. I've got to be married. I've got to be married. No, what I've got to have is a relationship with the Lord. Our contentment as Christians need to hang solely, totally, completely, on our relationship with the Lord. It should have nothing to do with our financial condition, our physical health, or our marital status. Yes, that's tough. That is difficult. But as Christians, that's our challenge. We can be content because of the strength Jesus provides us. We can be content in any set of circumstances. What should be considered before marriage or before remarriage? Now, this is why I say that this is something that young people need to be acquainted with as well. This is really important for us to remember that in our culture, there are some myths about marriage. They're not right. They're not true. But people think they're true, or they act as if they are true. Let me share with you from the book that I used for a lot of years in premarital counseling about some of these myths. Think about some of these myths and think about how in our culture it is so true that a lot of people think this. Marriage will end my aloneness. Marriage will heal my brokenness. Marriage will ensure my happiness. Every time I read that, I think, does anybody know any unhappy married people? If you know a couple, at least two or three, you probably. You see, marriage isn't this guarantee that some people think it is. Marriage is God's plan for everyone. I've already mentioned, we have over 400,000 in our country. Just in our country, we have over 400,000 people who've never married in their life. They're not weird. There's not something wrong with them. Marriage just isn't for everybody. It's for most people, but it's not for everybody. And do you honestly think, here you're up here and you say your I do's, you exchange your I do's, and you choose this poor, naive young lady. She's marrying this guy who, he's clawed and he's totally man. He's messy. He is really a messy man. Now, do you think because he said I do, that he is going to become a neat freak? Because he said Nope. Now, do you think that this poor girl was never taught at home how to cook? She didn't know a lick about cooking. And this guy, he really hadn't talked about that subject because they're always going out to restaurants. Well, they end up getting married. And he finds out she doesn't know a thing about cooking. Do you think because she said I do, she goes from being a non-cooker to an awesome cooker? I do is not a magic phrase. It doesn't just dramatically change people. If a person is broken and dealing with an issue, it could be an addiction issue. It could be some sort of a mental illness. And by the way, there's no shame in having a mental illness. None. Not one single shame should be attached to a mental illness. We are human beings. We live in human bodies. It's no shame to have a physical issue. It's no shame to have a mental issue. Do you think because you were a depressed person, clinically depressed, and you say I do, that you're no longer going to be? See, marriage isn't that myth that some people think it is. And that is a problem with remarriage. We think that if we get married again, we're going to feel better because we love being married and we hate being by ourselves and we're struggling with our loneliness in this new life. We need to realize those myths, whether it's a first marriage or another marriage. I met somebody in Clarksville, Tennessee, at the Hilldale Church of Christ in Clarksville, Tennessee last weekend. She came to me, and I think she goes to the Trenton Crossing Church in Clarksville, Tennessee. But she introduced herself to me, and she said she had been divorced 3 times and lost her last husband by death. Sometimes Murphy's Law applies to personal lives in real serious things. It can be a very, very difficult thing. The most important thing, I call it the trump card. It's the trump card. You know, like playing cards. I'm not referring to the president. This is the trump card when it comes to marriage. This is what we need to be preaching and teaching our kids from the time they're very young, and especially when they become teenagers and young adults. This is the most important aspect of a couple's relationship if they want to have a successful marriage. Spiritual compatibility. Here's why. When you are spiritually compatible, you have the same life blueprint. You're embracing the same values. You want the most important things more than anything in the world. Spiritual compatibility. Now, sometimes a person, a couple who worship in the same church building may be not compatible. Just because you show up at a church building doesn't mean that you're compatible to marry somebody of the opposite gender who worships in the same church. There is a lot of spiritual incompatibility, even within the walls of a church building. Here is one of the characteristics that I would want in a wife if I ever married again. I would want a wife who loves the Lord more than me. James Bender is a friend of mine. He's the minister of involvement in Jacksonville, North Carolina. He was wise beyond his years. I wish I would have heard this before anybody came calling for a daughter's hand in marriage. Somebody came calling for his daughter Jacqueline's hand in marriage. And when that young man asked about his daughter's hand in marriage, here's the question he asked him. Son, do you love the Lord more than Jacqueline? Now, if my father, I was 19 years old when I asked my prospective father-in-law for her hand in marriage. If my father-in-law would have asked me that question at 19 years old, I would have thought, this is a trick question. Because what I want to do is answer it the way he wants me to answer it. Had I got the guts to say that I love somebody else more than his daughter? What's he getting at here? Well, I think that a mature Christian can be described this way. A mature Christian loves the Lord more than anybody or anything. That's the way we ought to be. We cultivate a relationship with the Lord where He is the ultimate best blessing in our life that we don't want to live without. My church secretary for about 17 years of the 33 years I was with the Hartville, Ohio church, she did not grow up as a Christian, nor did her husband. They were in the military. She was the husband of an Air Force, highly successful Air Force person. And she came in contact with the church and she became a Christian. Well, he didn't become a Christian. And Jen started giving her a hard time about being a Christian. And obviously she started feeling that pressure. At one point in that stress, she said to Jim, Jim, don't make me choose between you and the Lord because you'll lose. Now you talk about guts. For a woman to say that to her husband, you got to have a lot of guts. Jim backed off a little. The ending of that story is eventually he became a Christian. He's an elder in the Lord's church now. You know, that's the way that we need to cultivate that kind of sentiment and that kind of attitude and spirit and value in the church. We need to have people who don't just claim to be members of the Lord's church, but they have in their heart a love for the Lord more than anything or anybody else. That's the only kind of person that I would ever consider marrying. When you find a person like that, that is the highest degree of spiritual compatibility. You don't have to be both the same maturity, but both of you need to have that highest value, something you both can embrace. You know, there are a lot of spiritual widows in the church. What I mean by a spiritual widow is a lady who comes to church without her husband because her husband's not a believer. She comes by herself. That's a spiritual widow. That can be a very lonely life as well. Another field of ministry that we need to make sure that we recognize. Time is an important characteristic of a good, healthy relationship where you raise the prospects of success. There is a time when we pretend with one another in male-female relationships. Let me explain to you about Ruth Ann, about my wife. When we were dating pre-marriage, she would never let me see her in rollers. Now, if you're so young, you might need to Google what rollers are, but hair rollers, okay? Google hair rollers. But I never saw her with hair rollers. She was putting her best foot forward. She didn't want to see me in her presence with rollers in her hair. After we said I do, she'd go to bed with those things. I mean, how romantic, how beautiful and how romantic is that? What happens is, over a period of time, and you need to give yourself enough time pre-marriage, you need to be able to see that person how they really are. Because what we do initially for a while in male-female relationships are we fake it. We put our best foot forward. We need to see a person when they're angry and upset. How do they handle that? We need to see a person when they're stressed. We need to see a person when they're really, really excited and happy. We need to see a person whenever they experience failure, when they experience success. See, over a period of time, what you do is you have experiences where you find out about people who they really are. Now, you're never going to know everything, but you need to know as much as you can. The more you know, the less the risk. But that time gives you the opportunity to know. Then you've got family and family differences. Not all families are the same. You're going to be blending two families, and you need to keep that in mind. I would never marry someone, speaking personally, I would never marry someone who in any way jeopardize or negatively affect my relationship with my 3 daughters, my 2 sons-in-law, my 5 grandchildren, or the mascot of the ministry, who is an Australian Labradoodle down in Gainesville, Florida, who's owned by 2 of my grandchildren. Now, I might give a little bit in regard to Ranger. If Ranger didn't like her, I might still marry her. But all the human beings in my life, I would not want to distance myself from them by marrying someone else. This blending of family is really important. People need to be on board in the family. And that can be a challenge, and that can take a lot of time as well. Every marriage is impacted by expectations. What are your expectations? You know, our expectations when we marry the first time are a lot of times based on what we grew up with, how we saw mom and dad react and interact with one another. So we take that into our first marriage. Now, after you've been married for a while, if you get married again, then you're going to take your experiences when you're married into that second marriage, and it's going to cause you to have some expectations. That may be a real struggle. Whenever I was doing premarital counseling, I would have a list of chores, and I would ask them both to fill them out independently. And I basically would say, who's going to take out the trash? Who's going to take care of the bank account? You know, who's going to take care of the car? I just had a list of about a dozen different things. I had them fill those out independently. Then I had them come together, and I said, okay, who's going to Who's going to take care of the checkbook? One would say one thing, one would say the other thing. Some of them would match, some of them would not. What I was trying to do with them is help them to think about, okay, what are your expectations? You need to talk about, think about, and agree with a lot of the important expectations if you want to have a success, really good marriage. Issues of health and sex, obviously. Would you marry somebody who had a cancer history? Well, possibly, Then, well, what about a person who has had some sort of an accident in the past? One of the things that we're going to do if I ever get married again is we're going to have a couple of dates. Well, actually, we're going to have 3, but the 2 dates that are really important before the I-dos is we're going to get a Zebco rod and reel, a really good one. And we're going to go to my doctor, my primary care physician. We're going to give the Zebco rod and reel to my doctor as a gift of appreciation. And then we're going to have him talk to us about my health. And then we're going to go out and buy a really nice planter of some sort, and we're going to take it to her doctor. And we're going to give the planter to her doctor. And her doctor then is going to talk to us 3 about her health. So romantic. But that's practical. We need to know. Sometimes people have hidden their health conditions of the past from their prospective mate. It can be tempting. I can tell you for a fact it's been done. I know of cases where that's been done. We've got to have an honest transparency about the health conditions and about expectations that may have to do with sexual things, especially in a second marriage. And then there is this super complicated issue. It is the finances. Now, let me tell you about this woman that I'm fixing to marry. Here is my dream scenario. Number 1, she's drop dead gorgeous. Now, that's a given, of course. Okay, she's drop dead gorgeous. She is a millionaire. She has 3 adult sons. So we go to my doctor, and we go to her doctor. Then we go to a financial planner. And we sort these kinds of issues out. Because, now think about the difference here. I've been a preacher all my life. I've got $1.50. She is a millionaire who has 3 sons. Okay, now let's assume for a minute that I die first. Each one of my 3 daughters get a 50-cent piece. Are they going to have to break that 50-cent piece and give a quarter to her sons because she has 3 sons? Or what if she dies first and there's $1 million? Do her sons have to share her $1 million with my daughters and me? It's very complicated. There are a lot of things that need to be talked about. There are some of them on that PowerPoint. I have been a super critic of prenuptial agreements since the day we started them in our country. They are like programming a marriage for failure. However, in this case, I can see if you have adult children who are very touchy about that issue, I can see that if everything else is pretty much in place and looks good, I can see the possibility of a prenuptial agreement calming the fears of those adult children who are really concerned about their inheritance. That's the one exception I would make. But it's really complicated if you have more than $1.50 to deal with this issue. But these are things that have to be discussed. And then where are you going to live? Are you going to live in his house or are you going to live in her house? Are you going to live in both? Are you going to sell one or are you going to sell both? Where are you going to live? It'd be good to talk about that before I do, not wait till after. There are a lot of things to talk about in regard to this issue. The one thing that we have to realize is that all human relationships have risks. When you choose to embrace somebody in your social network and call them a friend, I know we don't think about this, but we're taking a risk. You know what that friend can do to you? They can betray you. They can sin against you. They can hurt you. They maybe would never do it deliberately, some of those things, but some of those things they might do deliberately to you. Every human relationship comes at risk. Marriage is a human relationship, the most precious of all human relationships. It is a very big risk. In human relationships, you cannot eliminate risks, but here's what you can do. You can lower risks. Why do we risk human relationships? We see rewards. We see blessings. Is the reward worth the risks? Can you lower the risks and your chance of enjoying the reward? Yes, you can. And we certainly need to do that when it comes to something like a second marriage, especially if it's a marriage after loss. Remarriage at midlife or later is somewhat like the merger of two corporations. Be wise in what you are doing. If you've ever worked for a large corporation, you know that if there's ever a merger, there is a lot of time and attention in regard to details. If we're going to raise the possibility of a successful marriage, we've got to get into the nitty-gritty and the details. It may not be very romantic, but what you want to do is lower the risks and raise the possibility of greatness, magnificence in that marriage. Total giving of the total self for a total lifetime, whether it's a first marriage or any marriage after that. That is the goal. Hey, I've got some things I want the girls to pass out to you before we dismiss, and we are going to dismiss. Girls, do you have those things that you're going to pass out? Okay. Abby, come up here, Abby. Do you have the forks? Riley does. Okay, Riley. Abby, you and Emma, you pass out. Okay, Abby's going to do it. Emma has some like bookmarkers we're going to give to everybody who's here. Make sure everybody has one, not just one per family, but everybody. Now, Abby, here's Abby. Abby, turn around. Okay, if you are widowed, Abby, come back here. Okay, where you can see everybody because you've got two right here. If you are widowed, take one out and give it to me. Take one out and give it to me. If you are widowed, I want you to leave with one of these. This is a fork. If you're widowed, I want you to receive one of these forks. And you can go ahead and raise your hand now and let Abby get you one. Let me explain to you why that we are giving you one of these. This fork, remember, is a reminder about the fact that you have to make choices in your life. You didn't choose to be widowed, but you do have choices now to make in your life about the rest of your life because you didn't die just because your spouse did. What are you going to do with the rest of your life? I encourage you to set this somewhere. It might be on your nightstand. It might be on the kitchen counter. But leave this around to remind you, to spur your thinking about, okay, what am I doing now? What am I going to do now? Make the kinds of choices that glorify God and are a blessing to other people. If you make that choice, you'll never regret it, and you'll always honor the Lord's will in your life. Girls, thank you very much. All three of you girls, Riley, Emma, and Abby, thank you very much for helping out today. There are books in the back. If you have not seen one yet, but you'd like to see one, if you turn around there, Michelle, my oldest daughter who's here from Middle Tennessee, Michelle raised those books up. There is a book that I've written. It's not a big book. It's a small book by intention, because a lot of people are scared away by big books. It's called When the End Comes. And it is a book that I wrote really by the encouragement of others who said, why don't you write something? And so that's the first book. The second one is called Prepping for the End, and I'm working on that now. But that book back there is available. You can get it through Amazon if you buy books that way for $9. You can buy one for $8 if you buy one from my family. So Michelle has those books back there. If you'd like to have one for you or for somebody else, feel free to buy one. They're only $8. We can get you some change. But if it's of any help to you, we certainly want that to be the case. Then you feel free to use it for you or somebody else. We're going to go ahead and close with a song and a prayer. Do you have a song we could sing? Just maybe one verse. How about that just the chorus of Count Your Many Blessings again? Count your blessings. We can do that by memory. And then we'll pray and dismiss ourselves from that point. I hope you can come back tomorrow morning, because we're going to be talking about a lot things that have to do with dealing with life issues, about praising the Lord no matter what happens, and assigning purpose to your problems. And then what should we do when we're overwhelmed? Those are the three things we're going to talk about tomorrow morning. So I hope you can come. 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock. Go ahead, Cheryl Wayne, just the chorus, and then we'll pray together.
384, same one we've used, 384. Count your
Blessings, name them one
by one.
Count your blessings, see what God
has done. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your many blessings, see what God has done.
Let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you for today. We thank you for the fact that we could be out with others in public. We are thankful for this opportunity that this good church has afforded us to become maybe a little bit more educated and maybe a little bit more motivated to help people who are struggling with some pretty difficult times in their life. Father, we pray that you will bless us with a good afternoon and a nice evening. We pray that we'll be able to get some good rest, and we pray that we'll have safe arrivals to where we're headed after this dismissal. And we pray, Father, for a safe arrival back here tomorrow morning. Thank you, Father, for our blessings. Help us, Father, when we struggle with the loss of our blessings. Help us to come to appreciate the fact that you are what we need more than anything else or anybody else. Help us, Father, to cultivate a relationship with you that matters more than anything else and anybody else. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.